Welcome everyone. Thanks for checking out this panel. We're going to talk about the future of multi-collateral Dai. We're joined here with Rune Christensen, who is the founder of MakerDAO, Kyle Kistner, who is the co-founder of BZX, Nate Hindman, the head of growth at Bancor, and Francesco Renzi, who's the co-founder of rDai. And my name is Clayton Roche, and I'm the head of DeFi with Mosendo. Thank you all for joining. I'm just going to go ahead and kick it off. I'm curious to hear what you guys are most excited about with Dai supporting other collaterals than just Ethereum. It's kind of a big switch. Kyle, do you have any thoughts on that? What kind of interests you about Dai adding new collaterals?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit of a loaded question, right? I kind of have a tempered perspective on it. I do think it's interesting, but I think it also comes with certain challenges and risks. So, Maker is the foundation of DeFi right now, and it already does what we all need it to do extremely well. It provides a robust, decentralized stablecoin that projects like us, Compound, DYDX, all of us can build upon, and it's a really great foundation. One thing is that I think multi-collateral Dai is a very large increase in complexity. And I'm unsure that the benefits that we get from diversification outweigh the benefits from the complexity introduces. So multi-collateral Dai doesn't introduce novel functionality into DeFi that you couldn't get from other products right now, like Compound or Torque. You can borrow against other collateral right now. But when we move away from single collateral Dai, we're losing, or we're going to stop using what is literally the most battle-tested contract in the entire Ethereum ecosystem. And we're going to multi-collateral Dai on the basis that this diversification is going to be a very strong value add. But
Sure.
One thing that I'm concerned about is that ETH is going to continue dominating MCDs in terms of the collateralization. So if you look at some of the options that exist right now that can be that allow you to borrow against other things, people are mostly collateralizing in ETH. So if it's if MCD comes and then it's 95% ETH that is still collateralizing Dai, and we added all this complexity, then I'm wondering, was that worth, moving away from the most battle-tested contract in the entire Ethereum ecosystem?
Okay, I'm guessing Rune might have some comments he'd like to share on this. I'm going to give him a window to do that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I totally expect that in the beginning it will just be ETH primarily that we use, right? And we also we basically acknowledge that when the foundation proposed, we only add BET, right, with a relatively low debt ceiling as the initial additional collateral type to ETH. Mostly so that we can just get started with sort of figuring out what happens when you have multiple collateral types and sort of the dynamics and how to integrate that and so on. I would expect that to last for a long time, right? Because that's not really a bad thing. ETH is a very good asset that can carry DeFi very far, right? But I think it's obvious to it's clear to everyone, right, that DeFi in its current incarnation is really just sort of the primordial soup of where we're going, right? It's not really what we're doing today is not really what we hope that we'll be doing 10 or 20 years from now. So that's why it's still critical to do the necessary upgrades to support and be future-proof, right, as early as possible, because that just that reduces the overall risk, right, and the overall complexity of it, and even guarantees that it's even possible to do it all. Because of course, one day, and this is sort of the really fundamental dynamic, right? One day, if DeFi continues to scale, it simply will just not be safe to only use a single collateral type to back it. Both sort of inherently, just because, it's just not if you just use one type of collateral, it's kind of like the financial crisis, right? With everything being built on top of real estate that then turned out to be priced wrong. But then also some sort of the more like, there's also like the perspective that you'd never really want like even if you don't have like, let's say like a bubble in ETH or something like that, right? It just inherently is not a good idea to have a single point of failure, right? You really do want to like spread out your risk. And of course, what multi-collateral Dai offers on that front isn't just like, we can't just go and find another asset like ETH out there, right? Because there isn't anything like it. I mean, the closest would maybe be Bitcoin. So that's also why the next step is to move into real world assets, right? And that's kind of where we expect that the DeFi ecosystem will gain scale in the long run. But also just like, that's where it will find its real utility. Like, it's once you apply DeFi to the real world, that's when you actually start changing the world for real. And then on the topic of security, I just want to comment on that, right? Because sure. It's totally a valid point that like single collateral Dai is like one of the oldest dApps in the space, right? That's been live. Yeah, like it's had this massive bug bounty essentially this whole time. It's never been hacked, right? There was there's been some like vulnerabilities. Well, there's been at least one, right, that we fixed while the system was live, and also it wasn't a critical vulnerability. So like, there's never been anything like close to an actual risky situation with it. But I mean, the thing is that single collateral Dai is, works that well and is that safe because it was built on top of an earlier system, right? So it was actually there was Psi 1, which was the first one was called, right? The alpha before single collateral Dai. So like that's, ultimately it's a continuation of something that has existed longer than even the deployment itself, right? And that's first and foremost what's coming with multi-collateral Dai, right? Of course, it's kind of like all the experience and all the knowledge and sort of the battle testing of and sort of the like what we've learned from seeing how single collateral Dai actually behaved in the wild, right? And then it's just like on top of that, we've then applied like actual best practice, right? So formal verification and just like extreme meticulous approach to every single line of code in the entire code base, right? And in a way that has been totally impossible with single collateral Dai, because multi-collateral Dai has been underdeveloped. Like multi-collateral Dai was in development before single collateral Dai even was a concept. So like single collateral Dai kind of like came in there as kind of like, okay, let's build these alphas first to kind of like learn how to do it and reduce complexity a little bit. By not having multiple collateral types, so that we can sort of like approach this problem from both ends. But in the end, I mean, there are certain advantages of multi-collateral Dai that are simply impossible to get with single collateral Dai. And I mean, obviously formal verification is a big one. Another one is kind of like just a lot of the mechanics, how they function. Like there's some of the mechanics in single collateral Dai that simply were, they were kind of like just built quickly, so they just work. And as a result, there's some behavior that can get a little bit strange, and actually that becomes especially apparent once you actually have to even do the emergency shutdown, right? And like do the transition. So with that in mind, that's ultimately why we think it's just it's just a matter of like it has to be done eventually.
Sure. Like
single collateral Dai simply isn't future proof, right? So then we don't want to do it too early, right? I mean, we've literally spent, we've spent years just like optimizing the security of multi-collateral Dai. And ultimately now we're at the point where like we think the approach that's going to be the most secure is to try to migrate to multi-collateral Dai as quickly as possible to get kind of like these instant advantages. And then also obviously continue to iterate on multi-collateral Dai even after it's launched, because that's maybe the final really, really big advantage that it has, which single collateral Dai possesses this advantage to some extent, but multi-collateral Dai has really has kind of taken it to the extreme. And that is the ability to like upgrade the system on the fly, and kind of like the entire thing is so modularized that you can very easily replace any single component using the governance mechanism. And this way actually recover from even potentially like critical vulnerabilities, which of course we don't expect that to exist, right? But we don't expect that to exist in single collateral DAI either. And it's just, in the end, on the other hand, you always have to be prepared for it.
Sure, of course. And yeah, I appreciate, Kyle, I appreciate your points about, what we have now is sort of working. So why do we want to introduce this complexity? But Rune, I also like that lens. The way I think of it is that single collateral DAI is almost like a proof of concept for what DAI can really be. And to me, the thing that excites me the most is the potential of real world assets in multi-collateral DAI. I think that, like for me, I want to transition to a currency that we can use in the real world and can actually scale. And I think that that's a necessary step. Nate, you and I have talked a bit about sort of the relationship between Ethereum and DAI. I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on this this conversation so far.
Yeah, from our perspective, multi-collateral DAI seems super interesting. It creates this kind of new layer of incentives between protocols and DAI. Currently there's a lot of protocols that do have tokens and that are under pressure to use Ethereum or to use DAI, and you create this really interesting incentive mechanic. If your token is included in multi-collateral DAI, then the use of DAI in your protocol is in some ways utilizing your own token. So, I'm super interested in particular in this kind of alignment of incentives between the sort of protocols that have tokens and also multi-collateral DAI. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And how about you, Francesco? What are your thoughts on Francesco built rDai, and so I'm assuming you're going to have to kind of modify things to accommodate MCD. Curious your thoughts on
MCD, the migration is going to be horrible for us.
Okay.
Because we don't depend on DAI, right? Like we actually hardly ever touch DAI. It's mostly we depend on compound. So there will be a period where liquidity might, go this way, go that way. It's hard to say how long it'll take for actual borrowing to start happening with the new DAI. So yeah, we don't know how long it'll take, and it's all a bit weird. I'm actually super interested in it just to see how mature the ecosystem is, to see how fast we actually move, to see how many hiccups there are, who has problems. That I think will give us a very clear idea of who are the best players in the space, just how they handle this migration, because it's going to impact everyone. So
you said it was going to be horrible? Is that the word that you used?
Oh yeah, it's going to be horrible.
Okay.
I fully expect it will be horrible for us at least. I don't know for everyone else.
And when you say horrible,
really, because we're launching very soon, so it's literally the wrong time.
Okay. So it has a little bit to do with just your own product development and the timing in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. Okay.
But, no, it's very exciting. Very interesting point Nate brought up about the aligning incentives. That's very interesting. But I tend to agree with Kyle that I think multi-collateral DAI is trying to do too many things at the same time. I hope they don't, I remember hearing stuff about, other currencies that they could create by collateralizing DAI. Haven't heard them speak too much about that lately, but that seems to be extra stuff that probably they shouldn't do. Like, I think DeFi works very well because everybody does one thing very well. And so far, MakerDAO has been a very good stable currency. And that's what we all expect it to keep doing, right? So I hope they don't succumb to starting to want to do everything because they can. And I know they can. I just hope they don't even try. Let everybody else do the other stuff and just focus on being the central bank we all need, and keeping DAI stable. Because if they keep, I'm super excited like you about real world assets, right? That's, in my opinion, that's what's gonna take DAI to the next level and take the whole industry to the next level. But it adds so much complexity and risk management that they really have to just start only doing that. Like, you can't do too many things. So I just hope, MakerDAO can focus and just kind of, do their thing.
Sure.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Kyle.
There's no real necessary connection between real world assets and MakerDAO and multi-collateral CDPs. Like if Compound, put on their price feed some, real world asset, boom, people could borrow against that. So there's no real, it's not that we're waiting on Maker in order to let us use real world assets. I mean, the real blocker right now is custodians, people who will actually tokenize the real world assets, actually getting those tokens on the chain. Once it's there, there's quite a few people, like including us, who could possibly, let people borrow against it. So it's not like, MCD is the thing that we've been waiting for to get real world assets on the blockchain.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another thing that I talked about with Noor Hardy, who is our blockchain architect, has to do with some of the code upgrades. For instance, and I'm not a tech guy, but like there's some sort of approve function that's going to allow a certain type of wallet functionality that will, for instance, make smart wallets either somewhat unnecessary or at least a lot more flexible. There's just kind of some other code upgrades that come along with MCD as well as the DSR. And Rune,
I'm
maybe
really excited about that.
Yeah. Okay. What excites you about the DSR, Kyle?
Oh, well, I mean, I think that this was like the major thing that was missing from single collateral Dai. Like if there was one thing I wish, if there was a transition and, there was one critical thing that I think would need to be added, it's this DSR, because, the stability fee really just tamps down on demand. But really what they need is to be able to attract supply. You need monetary policy to be able to pull both the levers of supply and demand. And I'm sure, Rune and people at MakerDAO realize how completely critical that is. And we probably wouldn't have had the crazy upswings on the stability fee up to 20 and all of that if they were just able to pull that lever for the stability fee and get some more lenders in there.
Sure. And that's sort of how I see the transition to MCD more generally. Like, for example, adding more collateral types should allow for a higher supply cap in a safe way. Rune, do you see that in the same light, the relationship between adding new collateral and a higher supply cap?
Yeah, but I mean, I definitely agree with Kyle that at launch, the exciting thing really is the DSR, right? That's going to be the big game changer because it'll just make it so much more easy to manage the system and also keep it growing even as the market dynamics change. But then, I mean, that is also where like multiple collateral types become important, because if you want to provide an attractive DSR that's kind of like good at this, acting as this like risk-free base level, you need to be able to consistently attract, a very large amount of users on the supply side, right? That can actually collateralize assets with a system that provide, that sort of provide a similar, at least like a medium risk, medium reward type of profile, rather than just the high risk that we get with ETH. If we want to really scale to billions, right? Mm-hmm. But I mean, again, that's gonna be something that needs to be taken very slowly and further out in the future. And what we're doing now is we're just putting the basic infrastructure in place to eventually support this growth as it happens over time. And of course, also, I mean, I think something to keep in mind also is that there could really be this, DeFi is already approaching this kind of like inflection point, right? Where we could achieve like hockey stick type of growth, right? So that's also where, if you cannot, like with a stablecoin, if you can't just continuously expand supply to meet demand, you actually end up in some very strange situations if you have to start kind of like trying to cap usage overall of your system. It's kind of like a beast that once you set a stablecoin loose, it can be a little like a decentralized stablecoin loose. It's actually you really have to make sure that you can keep maintaining it, because you can't just like let it do its own thing. If there's more and more demand and you can't back that up with enough collateral, like your options aren't so great. Either you create a speculative bubble or you create negative interest rates or like all these like undesirable things. So it's really good to be able to onboard new collateral assets and then just like slowly. I mean, also to Francesco's point, right? Like be very to sort of like make sure that things are taken step by step, and the community learns and is comfortable with going the way they, you know, taking the direction that they take, and not just like blindly jumping into like big, you know, some big new initiative. Which is why, again, I mean, that just means getting the system in place and getting sort of like, you know, the fire drills prepared as early as possible. It really makes a lot of sense. But in the end, it is like the big killer feature is the DAI savings rate for sure. And the DAI savings rate, I think, is cool because we can look at certain areas in DeFi where there's already pools of DAI that could be earning that rate that are not otherwise earning anything. And one thing that comes to mind, Nate, is in liquidity pools. I guess I'm curious if you've thought about this at all. In liquidity pools where DAI is being provided, do you think that you could somehow capture that interest through the DSR, or is that something you've explored at Bancor, Nate?
Yeah, I haven't really looked into hooking, you know, DSRs into liquidity pools as much. Maybe, you know, Rune has kind of more experience there.
I see.
Rune,
Okay.
have you looked into that?
I mean, so the typical example of that we use for how we see that, you know, that the DAI savings rate can be used in more ways and more innovative ways than just like the simple, like a user can get a low risk, like continuous and stable return, right? But you can actually use the DAI savings rate to combine with other DeFi protocols to make some more advanced solutions, basically. And I think the most obvious example is how you apply something like the DAI savings rate to Compound, right? So you can actually use the DAI savings rate to boost the return that people get on Compound, because you can use the unutilized supply that's sitting in Compound. And right now, like, there's a lot of DAI sitting totally idle in Compound, doing absolutely nothing, right? All it does is kind of like taking the return away from the other suppliers, essentially. And what can happen is that, you know, what Compound can do is they can turn on the DAI savings rate for this unutilized supply, and through that actually, you know, give an extra boost to the average yield that a supplier on that platform will have. Which is generally why, I mean, we also see, like, we've never seen the DAI savings rate as being like competitive to DeFi protocols, right? Because it just provides something different, because it's this like low risk, low return, always available type of service, right? That actually has a really nice synergy with the more advanced lending protocols.
Kyle, I'm curious if you thought through on Fulcrum how the DSR might affect how you run things over there, as far as like Rune was talking about on Compound, any unutilized DAI that's in the pool could earn a DSR. Have you guys looked into that?
We had actually not, but that's actually a super interesting idea. I was just trying to run through how that would work in my mind as Rune was talking about it. The thing I had been thinking about, so, you know, like BZX and MakerDAO, we co-authored this paper, this article. It was like last year, around July or something like that. And we talked about something called iTokens, which are like tokenized loan pools. And, you know, later on, people knew like Compound C tokens and our iTokens as a result of that. And one thing we thought was really interesting was locking up these like iTokens into multi-collateral DAI and earning interest while you're taking out a loan. But, you know, one thing I've been talking to, you know, with like Robert from Compound is like the idea of like, well, what if you listed, you know, like iDAI on Compound, or you listed cDAI on Fulcrum, and then people, you know, lend it out there, and then suddenly you have like CiDAI or ICDAI, and then what if you went and you put that in multi-collateral DAI and you're lending that out, and, you know, or like, you know, maybe at the bottom there's like, you know, sDAI, some kind of like savings DAI, tokenized DAI savings rate, and then you're putting it through that entire process until you have something like CISDAI or something like that. That had been what we had been kind of like thinking about and like trying to figure out how that would work together with Maker. But like this idea at the end utilized assets, kind of like shipping them off to the other lending protocols. That's a pretty interesting idea as well.
I think what's important about the DSR is that there's no additional risk associated with it, as opposed to the scenario that you described, Kyle, where I would think that each iteration you'd have to analyze some risk. And I know that if one of these kind of meta tokens made it into consideration for MCD, like the collateralization ratio, for example, would be factored in by the DAO when they accepted that. Yeah. I'm curious, Francesco, I know when we talked about rDai, we talked a bit about like opportunities that you could use rDai's design for, like in a prediction market, when something is staked as collateral, for example, but it's not earning. We talked about the ability to direct your interest out of your wallet to another destination while still having the collateral. So I'm curious, like how the DSR either affects that or maybe it doesn't affect that.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is very similar. I remember listening to a podcast with Rune talking about this idea while we were developing it. So, I mean, it's been around for a while. I think the main difference is the risk and the reward, right? That's it. Every single protocol will have to think like, is it worth the risk to use something like rDai, which uses, Compound or even BZX, or is it better to use the DSR, lower risk, much lower reward? I mean, that's just up to each, each product. Obviously, we're going to hammer hard to get rDai out there. Higher rewards, so that's going to be our selling point. Sure. And everybody will come back. Yeah, but what are the risks? So I mean, they're both good products. I mean, the DSR clearly has a huge advantage because of the name of Maker, but I think people will be attracted by the high rewards. Until there's a major hack in DeFi, people don't really perceive the risk like they should. It's not priced in. So I would consider that for the moment, people will prefer the high returns. Once something happens, people will start running to the DSR, unless something happens to Maker, in which case we're all screwed. So, we just have to kind of hope that the Maker's fine and everything else is fine, and just see what people decide to use. But yeah, I mean, the idea of having locked money is bad, right? Especially with everything we've got in DeFi. I think anybody managing an interest pool, anybody managing a pool of DAI should put it into an interest pool. Like, sure. You mentioned that Nate could possibly use it in Bancor. I don't know if you guys have been following a product called Balancer. So Balancer is planning to use rDai in their build. So they will basically have a pool of 3 different stablecoins, which will be using the R token framework to gain interest in the meantime. So basically they have this kind of exchange pool where they are also earning interest. So I think this is going to be how everybody builds stuff moving on. Like if you're building DeFi and you have a lot of DAI and you're not earning interest, you're doing it wrong. It doesn't make sense. At least the DSR, that's the benchmark. Like if you don't use the DSR, you're wasting your time. If you use the DSR, that's good. Maybe you could, turn up and go and use something more risky like rDai. We're probably also going to integrate the DSR. Actually, we're kind of thinking about this because with rDai, we always want it to be redeemable, right? And clearly, if we're using Compound or if we're using BZX, it depends on their liquidity. It's not always easy to redeem. If there's very low liquidity in the lending pools, then people can't redeem, and there's the bank run situation. So we've been thinking about keeping a part of our deposits in the DSR in order to have the immediate liquidity at all times. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it does. Nate, I'm curious over at Bancor, like I know that you guys, I don't actually know what percentage of your activity is with DAI, like as far as the pools go. Do you have a sense of that?
I'd have to look on the site, but I think DAI is one of our bigger liquidity pools.
Okay. And so like, I'm just curious around the office with your team, if you've talked about the implications of the switch and what it means for Bancor.
Yeah, well, I think it's not just what it means for Bancor, it's kind of what it really means for the space. And I think this is a question that came up in the beginning of our conversation that like we haven't really addressed as much as I'd like to, which is, Kyle in the beginning brought up that the sort of complexities of this change don't outweigh the benefits. And then, we heard from Rune about how, it kind of is about diversifying risk, having more collateral in there outside of DAI does sort of, avoid the single point of failure if something were to happen with ETH. So I guess I'd love to hear from kind of Kyle in response to that. Like, do you feel that the benefits of sort of having other collateral in there and diversifying the risk of DAI away specifically from ETH, because certainly this is something that Bancor has also faced too in its decision to create a multi-blockchain liquidity network that functions across many different blockchains in the hope that if something were to happen with ETH, that it wouldn't bring down the whole liquidity network. And I wonder if there is parallels there with MCD.
So you're wondering, like, if something happened to Ethereum itself, would MCD help diversify the risk of that?
Right.
Well, I mean, I do think maybe a question for Rune to some extent, but I'll give my answer, which is I think that if there's a problem with ETH itself, then DeFi and Maker has a big problem because we have a pretty big dependency on Ethereum. In general, we're not diversified across multiple chains like the contracts themselves. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, I guess I'm more referring to Ethereum as the currency, not necessarily the blockchain, right? The price of
like the regulatory risk and people.
No, more just the price, the value of the currency and how, that can affect DAI, and whether having, multiple currencies in there, even if they are based also on the blockchain, sort of diversifies that risk.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely diversifies the risk. There's no two ways about it. And that's helpful. I think like one of my points though was just that ETH has shown itself to be a very robust reserve currency. It's shown itself like we've gone through some very extreme price movements of, we've collapsed like almost 90% from when DAI originally came out. And so I think it's sort of shown itself to be battle tested, at least to some extent. I think, like Rune said, trying to think about the far future, there will be a time at which, we'll look back and we'll say, yeah, single collateral DAI was battle tested, but like now multi-collateral DAI has been out for 15 years and that's battle tested. And so we've kind of, gotten over the initial complexity hump. So, I think.
And what about, sorry to cut you up, but what about the argument that a lot of sort of ETH people are saying, which is that this adding more optionality for collateral is in some ways undermining the value of Ether currency?
Yeah, I want to comment on that because that's something I've been, I've been in that discussion a lot. So there, and I really think that there's there are a lot of people that are actually, in fact, possibly many of the people who are having this reaction. And I think there's a lot of people that very strongly come out with this opinion, right? And can get really angry, sometimes like angry at me or whatever, other people in working for the foundation or something, right? And I think what's happening is, it's like there's people with a lot of ETH holdings that have been sort of in their heads, like they've been pricing ETH as like ETH is guaranteed to like back all value of all currency in the future because DeFi is going to take over and it's all going to be ETH only, and like, so it's, it reminds me a lot of like the Bitcoin maximalist type of thinking, right? Where like you really have this like view in your mind that like this asset is going to take over everything and just like become sort of like, you know, like a standard that just everyone uses in all cases and without never worrying about, or even it won't even be sort of a reality that it's volatile or risky or anything like that, right? But like the fact is just like that's never going to be possible, right? Because you would never, it would just be, it is just fundamentally impossible to like scale a single collateralized stablecoin, right? For the same reason that you cannot just like endlessly pump CDOs backed by real estate, right? Because eventually, because what's happening is if you think that a stablecoin, like that it's safe, or rather like if you think that a stablecoin should drive the price of ETH, right? So it's kind of like DAI should provide the value to ETH, then you're thinking about it the wrong way. It's really that ETH needs to inherently have that value, and then DAI can draw the stability out of it. If you try to do it the other way, it's kind of like you're putting the cart before the horse, right? And sure, it's going to be a lot of fun on the way up because you can really like pump a lot of value into ETH, obviously, if you just like over leverage it. The problem is when things start going down, then you'll actually get the opposite effect. Like you'll have DAI totally destroying the price of ETH as you get this liquidation cascade, right? So so that entire like worldview was just wrong from the very beginning, and people who thought that way were really, what they were actually looking forward to was like a financial crisis type of, like a real crash, right? Where the price would actually go from 100 to 0 in like a very, very short amount of time. So not like the crash we saw in the past where it kind of like fizzled out and went down with, what was it, 98% over a year, right? But like financial crisis style where, you know, we lose 50% within a block or something crazy like that, right? Which actually will be truly harmful to the system, right? And it all comes down to whether you have the value of ETH driving DeFi or whether you have DeFi driving the value of ETH, right? And if it's DeFi driving ETH, that's just not a good thing. But the thing is that if ETH is not gaining its value from being pumped up by DeFi, where does its value actually come from, right? And the answer to that is very easy, right? It's proof of stake. It's staking and earning the fees, right? So the value of ETH actually comes from the transactions happening on the blockchain, not from like it getting pumped up by DeFi. And once you realize that that's how it's going to be priced in the long run, and that's where its value will be derived from at a very large scale, having multiple collateral types is actually, and you know, having real world assets is actually extremely beneficial, right? Because all of these new assets that are going to come onto Ethereum because they're going to be used as collateral in the MST, they're all going to be like extra sources of transactions, right? And just like extra revenue going to ETH holders. So it's actually this like virtuous circle where a multi-collateralized DAI not only like on one hand, it kind of like reduces the dependency of DAI on the price of Ethereum. But on the other hand, it actually also boosts the price of Ethereum and thus actually allows Maker to even like to scale how much like value and stability it can safely draw out of ETH. So just like all around, like massively increases scalability, right? And then also like, you know, should make everyone more happy and you know, provide better value. And ultimately, it's just like the problem is, of course, that you can talk about the reality as much as you want, but like there's some people that just will, you know, they will just like, you know, they'll just disagree, right? Because for whatever reason, right? People just trust ETH. It's like, you know, it's just like, you know, and there's a lot of people out there that just like fundamentally, you know, distrust anything that they will label as like centralized, right? Or anything related to banks or the legal system and so on. And there certainly is like very real risks that really must be taken very seriously there, right? But I mean, yeah, like in the Maker community, this discussion happened, you know, 3 or 4 years ago or something, when people first realized that real world assets would be needed in order to scale in the long run. So it's kind of funny to see it now getting rehashed on Twitter in much more like extreme and irrational terms. But like ultimately, yeah, I mean, so one last kind of like solution, or I guess you can say, yeah, like solution, or at least like something that can kind of like get everyone what they want, right? Is that because multi-collateral DAI has this capacity to create, you know, multiple stable coins, and not just a USD peg DAI, but actually any type of sort of variant on the basic product, right? It would be possible for Maker governance to also launch just like what we call like a purity DAI, right? So like a stable coin that's backed only by ETH or only by some particular type of collateral. And, you know, whether there's real demand for it or whether it's more like it's more like a meme, right? Where it's not really that people want to use it themselves. It's more like they want other people to use it, you know, then we'll see whether it actually becomes a reality. But what's important is, of course, that in the end, Maker will always just want to serve as many users as possible, right? And scale as much as possible and provide as much utility as possible.
Yeah, I agree with Rune, because I just think it's such a profoundly unhelpful way of thinking to, instead of just design systems that work and are robust, concern yourself with what the price action will be on some asset that you happen to hold. I just think that this is completely the wrong way to go about building systems.
I mean, I agree with you, but I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of people who think that way, and it's kind of hard. That's the way we were brought up to believe, that a single currency system is most efficient, right? And if you're all using the same currency, then and efficiency is the answer, but that comes at the expense, I think, in many ways, of the resilience of systems, and also the ability to have, you know, many different monetary policies that can build, you know, valuable incentive systems that can lift up all ships. So, yeah, it's interesting debate.
Yeah, Francesco, did you have any comments on this?
Well, I find it quite funny that Rune would say that fears of centralized assets are irrational, because I completely disagree. They're not irrational, they're completely rational. And we should be scared of centralized assets, because they will bring a lot of issues that we won't fully know how to handle. So I disagree so much. And I hope that Maker holders keep centralized assets to a minimum for a long time, and at least that they prioritize geographic distribution as much as possible, and jurisdictional distribution as much as possible, and company distribution as much as possible, because centralized assets are handled generally by companies who do the tokenization, and then they're in a specific jurisdiction, right? And if it's too concentrated in any country, it can become a big issue. So I'm not part of Maker governance. I don't have Maker, and I don't really know how they manage risk. I just hope they do it properly for the sake of all of us, because I agree that DAI shouldn't pull the price of ETH, but the reality is that it does. DeFi is pulling the price of ETH, in my opinion. It's keeping us afloat, and it will be what propels us. So as much as, you know, we hope that ETH usage brings traction and brings growth in the price, I think that will be fueled by DeFi. So I hope we don't have any serious issues in the biggest DeFi app, which is Maker.
So,
right? So yeah, I'd actually love to hear what Rune has to say about centralized assets, because I don't think the fears are irrational. I think they're very real. So I'd really love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, just to clarify, I definitely did not say that it's irrational to think there are risks with centralized assets, because I mean, of course, I mean, on the contrary, right? What I said was that there are very real risks, and like there are very real issues that need to be considered. I mean, and I think you summed it up perfectly, right? You really need to because when you think about centralized assets or real world assets as collateral in Maker, what that means is if you want to maintain the overall decentralization of the system, you have to design that yourself, right? You have to make sure that you really spread the risk and diversify it across as many jurisdictions as possible, and asset types, and so on and so forth, right? But I mean, something to but the reason why that makes sense, though, and why if you do that, you're not actually putting yourself in a worse spot than where we are today with just using ETH, for instance. That is because that's fundamentally how like the decentralization of Ethereum and Bitcoin themselves also work, right? I mean, and like people aren't too scared, right? I mean, of course there are people have healthy skepticism towards it, right? But ultimately, we don't really see people constantly losing their minds over the fact that the price of ETH is actually, is entirely decided on, by centralized exchanges, right? And generally, like the entire, like ultimately how all of the Bitcoin and ETH markets work. This is of course true to a less extent for the other altcoins, but then instead they rely directly on Bitcoin and ETH themselves, right? But like the Bitcoin and ETH markets are like very, very integrated with like regulators, and it's entirely based on, like, price discovery is entirely based on fully centralized exchanges, right? That are all totally regulated and like deeply in touch with regulators, right? And there's actually not that many of them, right? And they're concentrated in the US and China. So like ultimately that doesn't mean that it's not decentralized, right? And it doesn't mean that it's totally unsafe or something, because first of all, I mean, there are of course also a lot of other sources of liquidity, right? And there's the ability to kind of like adapt to crackdowns and so on, right? And in fact, it's even happened before, right? I mean, Bitcoin even somewhat easily, or at least like Bitcoin was able to like get past the Mt. Gox situation, right? Even though that was actually an extreme level of centralization. But yeah, I mean, my point is that the same thing that keeps Bitcoin and Ethereum decentralized and safe, right, and sound, despite it relying on centralized infrastructure, that is what you have to apply as well to something like Maker, right? If you're going to actually use centralized assets directly. And one of the cool advantages that we get is that you really do get to like design this for real, right? So we can't decide where the biggest Ethereum and Bitcoin exchanges are going to be, right, in the world. That just happens, and it's outside of anyone's control. And if everybody wants to use Mt. Gox, it actually just happens, and there's nothing to do about it, right? But with Maker governance, you can absolutely like set a hard limit and say, we're not going to have more than 10% of the collateral be backed by the US legal system or something like that. And ultimately, try to kind of like balance off the unique type of risk from each approach, right? So like Bitcoin and ETH have their own unique risks, but they also have some really amazing advantages. And I think especially ETH, right, with proof of stake has this like incredibly strong kind of like core that provides a lot of value and stability. But it does still have these disadvantages, right, and correlation and so on. And ultimately there is just some mix, some way of bundling these different things together so that you can like play off all the advantages and disadvantages from each of the different assets, and ultimately just get a diversification and sort of like an overall exposure that's superior.
I agree with you, Rune. One way that I kind of think about it is like centralized assets are not inherently scary. Like say you were an investor, right? And you held a basket of centralized assets that included real estate in several countries, currencies from several different countries, corporate bonds from several different countries. These are all centralized assets. Government could come and seize the house, the property deed in one of the countries. One of the currencies could hyperinflate and turns out one of them was Zimbabwe dollars or something like that. But because of the power of diversification, just because each of these assets are centralized and could go to zero because of some kind of centralized action, doesn't mean that you're at some kind of very high level of risk. If you properly diversified, you should be hedged against that. Some of these assets will go up, some will go down, some black swan events will happen, but in totality, you should be fine. And so centralized assets are scary in isolation, but in a basket that's been properly weighted and with like rigorous risk management practices, it's actually quite safe and safer than even like one decentralized thing.
Yeah, and of course to get there, the absolute key is taking it step by step. Right? You're not going to get to the perfect diversified ultimate basket by just like jumping in and just like doing it, right? You have to actually be very careful and take it slow. But I think there's also one last thing, and maybe this is also one of the killer advantages of MCD versus SCD that really has to be highlighted, right? So that is that in MCD, MKR holders who make the decisions around all of this stuff, right? They are also going to start to be on the hook for any potential bad decisions that they make, right? So that and this is actually not the case in single collateral DAI, and that's also one of the really compelling reasons to upgrade, right? So what that means is that if MKR holders, they decide, okay, we have this cool basket and we have, some American bonds and we have some European currency and then we have some Zimbabwe currency, right? And then the Zimbabwe currency blows up and there's a lot of money lost. Then obviously everyone would be like, well, why on earth did you pick freaking hyperinflating currency, right? That was a really stupid decision. And it wouldn't be fair if DAI holders had to take that loss, right? So of course the system is built so that, well, if you want to make stupid decisions, you have the power to do so, but you also have to pay for it, right? And that's how the incentives are aligned, so that ultimately there's nobody who wants, diversification to be done right, more than MKR holders, right? MKR holders are the ones who truly have like everything at stake to make sure that they don't do some crazy experiments or, just like act too fast and loose, right? They've got everything sort of set up so that it's in their absolute best interest to take things slow and be very careful and be very like thoughtful and risk averse in how to actually grow the system.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Kyle and Rune about having a diversified basket of centralized assets. If you think about it, it really kind of models a decentralized system when you have a sufficiently diverse basket of centralized assets, for the same reason that you're not centralized in one country or one jurisdiction or one asset type. So we're coming to a close here. I guess I wanted to go around real quick just to ask everyone if they had any final thoughts to offer on this conversation. Super awesome dialogue about these topics. Maybe I'll start with you, Nate, if you're ready. Just curious if you had any final observations maybe on this topic of centralized assets, or what do you want to leave us with?
Excited to see how things play out. Largely agree with a lot of what's been said. So no final thoughts from me.
Nice. And Francesco, how about you?
Yeah, I'm really excited to see where Maker goes. I hope we can create a very circular economy. I think we're not there yet. We need to have places to spend and have places to earn, so that the money keeps in the system. And I think that's what sustainability looks like. And I'm also super excited about derivative tokens. So, I think for now we've only scratched the surface. I think rDai was a pretty cool derivative, new functionality and stuff. But I think we're going to see stuff which is really new. We're going to see tokens that make money do things we can't really think of. And I think we haven't seen that yet. I'm really excited to see things that are not vanilla. I think for now we've only got vanilla money. We need more flavors. We need to see more derivatives. So yeah, that's what excites me in DeFi. Nice.
I like that. And Kyle, how about you?
Yeah, I think I feel good about the dialogue. So I'll just leave my part where it is.
Okay. And Rune, how about yourself?
Yeah, one of the big things I'm looking forward to with the MCD launch is that there's been a lot of exchanges and like partners and infrastructure that's actually been holding back from integrating DAI or using DAI, all because they've always been anticipating the launch of MCD and they've been like, I don't want to integrate something and then have to upgrade later. Especially considering how the foundation has always been, it's coming in 3 months, don't worry, it's coming soon, right? And then it ended up lasting a bit longer than anyone would have expected, right? And so that means that there's actually a lot of new adoption coming right alongside the launch of MCD, because there's been many people just waiting for that.
I see. Nice. That's good. That's good information to have.
Exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting. And I'll go last. Rune, I just really liked your observation about the transition to MCD and the way that strengthens the fundamental value of Ethereum. I think that you're absolutely right. This argument that we need to keep Ethereum as the only asset so that it pumps up the value of Ethereum is definitely the wrong way of thinking about it. And to think of this as a transition that actually supports the whole system and hopefully helps, drive basically transactions and gas fees and the fundamental value of Ethereum, as opposed to the kind of speculative over leveraging and then eventual collapse of that, I think is super valuable way of looking at it, and definitely more focused on longevity instead of immediate rewards. Well, thank you all so much for this chat. It was very enlightening, and yeah, cheers, guys. I look forward to the transition here shortly.